Welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're diving into some incredibly complex, highly charged source material that completely challenges traditional political loyalties within the Black community. It's a fascinating piece of political commentary pushing for a massive paradigm shift in how Black voters engage with American politics, specifically taking aim at the Democratic Party. Now, this is a really provocative narrative, and my goal today is just to map out these arguments for you completely neutrally, using the speaker's exact claims so you can understand exactly where they're coming from. So why exactly are some commentators urging Black voters to sever these deep traditional political ties? Well, let's dive into this. To get it, we really need to understand the socio-political critique laid out by our source. We're stepping into a very specific, alternative political narrative here. And remember, we aren't here to validate or debunk this stuff, right? We're just impartially mapping out what's being argued. The speaker wants a total severance of long-standing political ties. To grasp why, we've got to look at how they view the history and the current state of American political parties. To keep things focused, we'll map this out in 5 steps. 1. The Democratic Party critique. 2. Liberals versus conservatives. 3. Historical claims and reevaluations. 4. The Iron Triangle concept. And finally, 5. Examining community priorities. All right, moving right into section 1, the Democratic Party critique, focusing on subservience versus leadership. The foundational argument of our source here is that the Democratic Party actively positions minorities in a place of subservience just to maintain political power. The core of this argument lies in a massive contrast of expectations. According to the speaker, the political left has completely misread what Black men actually want. While the Democratic Party allegedly expects victimhood, grievance, and generational dependency disguised as compassion, the speaker forcefully argues that Black men actually want to be calculators, providers, builders, and leaders. They argue that waking up to this fundamental mismatch is exactly what's driving a shift away from traditional voting patterns. In fact, the speaker claims that Black voters are doing the math. They're looking back at 50 years of political promises and comparing them to the actual results on the ground: broken homes, poor schools, and high crime. The source puts it like this: generational welfare didn't build wealth in our communities, it built generational poverty. Because of this, the speaker argues that leaving the Democratic Party isn't some act of betrayal. Actually, they frame it as an act of manhood and calculated leadership. To back up this deep distrust, the speaker outlines a specific historical trajectory of the Democratic Party. Step 1, they argue its history is rooted in slavery. Step 2, they say it evolved into the party of Jim Crow and redlining. And Step 3, they claim it's now manifesting as the party of socialism. To really drive this point home, the source shares a stark historical anecdote. They describe a time when a white Democrat would literally sit in a polling booth with a shotgun, explicitly intimidating Black voters with threats of violence if they didn't vote the party line. The speaker uses this to argue that the party has always been an institution of control. Which brings us to section 2, liberals versus conservatives, a reversal of expectations. Here is where the speaker presents a pretty jarring reversal of what you might typically expect based entirely on their own lived experiences. They actually claim that white liberals are the real racists, stating that they frequently hurl extreme racial slurs, like the N-word or calling people a sellout, at Black conservatives. Conversely, the speaker reports that their personal visits to MAGA events and interactions with conservative supporters have been incredibly welcoming. They state they just haven't experienced blatant racist comments from the political right. To explain this dynamic, the speaker pulls from conservative economist Thomas Sowell, bringing up the idea that racism is essentially on life support, and Democrats are doing everything they can to keep it there. The argument here is that the political left is artificially funding and sustaining the concept of widespread racism because they absolutely need it for political projection and control. They're arguing that the left needs minorities to feel inferior to maintain their reliance on the party. It's a claim that fundamentally flips how we traditionally view political compassion in everyday discourse. Now we're transitioning to section 3, historical claims and reevaluations, focusing on some very uncomfortable alignments. This is probably the climax of the explainer, because the source makes some really surprising claims regarding major civil rights figures. Let's look at the evidence the speaker presents. In 1966, Martin Luther King Jr. was awarded the very first Margaret Sanger Award by Planned Parenthood. Because MLK couldn't attend, Coretta Scott King delivered his acceptance speech, and she outright praised Margaret Sanger's tradition, saying their nonviolent struggle might not have been so resolute without it.
The speaker in our source is just utterly baffled by this historical alliance. They point out that Planned Parenthood has been responsible for the termination of millions of pregnancies in the Black community. And they question how the biggest civil rights figure in history could be aligned with an organization like that.
Let's break down the speaker's specific assertions here. First off, they claim that Margaret Sanger actually despised the Black race and wanted to exterminate it. Second, they pivot to a theological critique. They assert that Martin Luther King Jr. actually denied the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ and his virgin birth. Because of this, the speaker argues MLK was practicing a social gospel, basically using Christian morality for earthly political rewards rather than true biblical divinity. Again, we're just mapping out the claims of the source here, which clearly seeks to completely deconstruct the traditional veneration of these historical figures.
Moving right along to Section 4. The Iron Triangle Concept, a Structural Critique.
So, how exactly are these historical alignments and political paradigms maintained within the community? Well, the speaker relies on a specific sociological framework to explain this, specifically author Vince Everett Ellison's concept of the Iron Triangle. This is an alleged alliance between three figures: the Black preacher, the Black community organizer, and the Black politician. The source argues that this trio operates as a strict institutional mechanism of control. According to the speaker, these three pillars work together to enforce political conformity, keeping the community tied to the Democratic Party, and, in the speaker's very blunt view, actively pushing the community to support its own demise. Which brings us to our final section: examining community priorities, media focus versus reality. Our source heavily critiques modern social justice movements here, arguing there is a massive disconnect between what the media focuses on and the actual day-to-day reality of Black Americans. While the media narrative frequently emphasizes the threat of police violence against Black men, the speaker counters this with a really stark reality check about the daily stress on what they call the corporate plantation. As they put it, "I only talk to a cop about once every 2 or 3 years, but I talk to my boss every damn day." They're arguing that microaggressions in the workplace and everyday economic struggles are a far more pressing reality than the police. Essentially, they're asserting that the media intentionally scares the community with the wrong issues to distract from everyday economic realities. And this disconnect between media focus and daily reality goes even deeper. While activists focus heavily on police violence, white-on-black crime, and institutional racism, the speaker claims the true, devastating reality is intra-community violence. The speaker makes a heartbreaking personal claim in the source material. They state that every single Black person they know who has been killed was killed by another Black person. And they argue that these deaths are almost entirely ignored because they just don't fit a politically useful narrative. To illustrate this point, the speaker provides a really tragic anecdote about a brilliant leader in the Delta Sigma Theta sorority who was brutally murdered, stabbed 100 times by her own husband, right in front of their daughter. According to the source, when the family reached out to high-profile civil rights attorney Ben Crump, his office allegedly rejected the case. Why? The speaker argues this rejection happened simply because the perpetrator was also Black, meaning there was no racial angle to exploit. The source concludes that organizations like Black Lives Matter and modern civil rights leaders are merely race hustlers, a term they actually borrow from Booker T. Washington, who only care about a tragedy if it can push a specific political agenda. And that brings us to the end of this incredibly dense, challenging critique. We've seen how the source completely deconstructs traditional political loyalties, reevaluates major historical civil rights icons, and heavily questions the motives of modern social justice movements. It's a forceful, unapologetic call for a paradigm shift. So the question I want to leave you with today is this: when foundational historical narratives and long-standing political alliances are challenged so aggressively from within, how do communities navigate that kind of shift in the modern era? It's definitely a lot to think about. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this explainer today, and keep seeking to understand the complex ideas shaping our world.